Do a brief introduction to myself. So my name's Symon Garfield. I am a consultant. I focus on strategy, business, knowledge, and technology. I'm an MVP for SharePoint, and I work for a partner in the UK called Foundation SP as the head of business consulting. I'm one of the co-leaders of the SharePoint user group in London. We meet every 2 months at Cardinal Place, Microsoft's offices. Always welcome to join us. I have written a book called The Art of SharePoint Success, Delivering Business Value from SharePoint Investments. I do some work with Microsoft, not for Microsoft, but with Microsoft, as what they call a Virtual Technology Solutions Professional, VTSP, which means that I support Microsoft's sales team when they go in and talk to enterprise clients. I'm a regular contributor to CMS Wire, website you may be familiar with. All of the material I'm going to talk through today has just started to appear on CMS Wire with a slightly different title. It's a mini-series called Knowledge is Power. And the first one came out last week. And some of the content we're going to look at this morning relates to that. I also am doing some research at Henley Business School as part of a doctorate. And a lot of the material that I'm going to talk through today is the material that I've been reading as part of my literature review for that program. So something I'm very interested in, and I hope you find it interesting as well. There is, of course, various websites. I'm on all of the more fashionable social networking channels. I am the only Symon Garfield in the world that spells Symon S-Y-M-O-N. So if you want to find me on Twitter or LinkedIn or Delicious or Flickr or on the web or anywhere like that, you can find me just by using a search engine of your choice and looking for Symon with a Y. There is one story on there, which I probably shouldn't draw attention to, but yes, it is me. But once something's out there, you just can't get rid of it, can you? So this is what I'm going to talk about. I think that there's a problem with social, and I'm using a very broad term social until I get down to some definitions a little bit further on in the presentation. The problem, I think, with social, just to kind of preempt it, is that people can't define it. They can't explain it, and they can't tell you what the value proposition is. It's all rather fluffy, and I've got some evidence to back up those statements. I'm going to argue that there's actually no such thing as social business. I believe So I'll tell you how you can do social if it's a road that you choose to go down. And then at the end, I will wake you all up, because I'm sure you had a late night, and I'll tell you what I've just been talking about for the last hour. So if you want to have a sleep now, and I'll catch you all in about 55 minutes. Okay, so the problem with social. There is, in my opinion, absolutely no doubt whatsoever that social is changing the world. So it's changing the world at a geopolitical and international level. So here's Mr. Obama. I don't see if you can, President Obama. Any resemblance, anyone? Can you see it? No, never mind. So he said in a speech on the Middle East in 2011, as you can see on the slide, cell phones and social networks allow young people to connect and organize like never before. He goes on to say some more. Some people, I saw one quote attributed to a protester in one of the Arab Springs protests, and they say, we organize it on Facebook, we coordinate it on Twitter, and we tell the world about it on YouTube. So lots of people have made comments that things like social media are having some sort of impact with things like the Arab Springs. It's challenging established national laws. Those of you from the UK may remember a couple of years ago, was it last year in fact? It was last year, the case of Ryan Giggs, who got a court order out to protect his name from being published in the newspapers with regard to an affair, so we had a gagging order on the press. Unfortunately, everybody named him on Twitter, and you can see here an MP just across the road, John Hemming, who said with about 75,000 people having named Ryan Giggs on Twitter and therefore breaking the court order, it's obviously impractical to imprison them all. And then you've got the Lord Chief Justice, who said in relation to Twitter, modern technology is out of control. It's changing the way that people spend their time at an individual level. So here are some statistics taken from a website. So I don't know if you remember this young lady, Parish Brown. This was just from last month in the UK. So she was Britain's first youth police commissioner, police crime commissioner. Unfortunately, before they appointed her, they didn't check out what she'd been saying on social media. The press, of course, did, found some potentially offensive remarks that she'd made, and then she had to resign in tears quite quickly. I think she's about 16 years old. So regardless of what she said, you know, that's, for her, probably not a very nice experience. So hopefully she learned from it, but definitely have an effect on people's lives. As far then as work is concerned and organisations, the first person that really looked in detail at how social technologies were being used in the workplace was Professor, and I picked the term out, Professor Andrew McAfee. He's a professor at Harvard Business School. And he did a piece of research which was originally published in the Harvard Business Review in around about 2006. And then he went on, as these people do, to write a book called Enterprise 2.0, a phrase that he coined. So as you can see, he's got quite a balanced view. And bear in mind, this is based on evidence, okay? He'd gone and done research that was published in a top-quality, peer-reviewed academic journal where lots of other scientist-type people had agreed that the methods that he had gone through to collect his data, to analyse it and present his results were all in line with good scientific practice, okay? So that's something that I'll ask you to kind of bear in mind when you're thinking about social and people are telling you things. What is your evidence for that? So his conclusion was that Enterprise 2.0 technologies, I've added the emphasis here, have the potential to usher in a new era. Because of the challenges, so he's raising the point that there are challenges that these technologies bring, there will be significant differences in companies' abilities to exploit them. But because of the opportunities, these differences will matter a great deal. So that's quite a balanced point of view, okay? Since then, the market's gone a little bit crazy. So since 2006, you can see here some quotes. So Forrester said last year that the market... $1 billion buying Yammer. So against that background then, you've got some other people popped up. So this is a book written by two consultants that work for a marketing company, essentially, Dakis Group. And they say in their book, everything that can be social will be social. I firmly believe that that's the mantra of 21st century business. So that was written 6 years after Andrew McAfee gave his quite balanced view about the potential, but challenges and opportunities. And all of a sudden, 6 years later, everything that can be social will be social, and we must all internalize it. Now, I have speed read this book. I haven't read it in detail, but at the end of that book, I'm still struggling to find the evidence for the statement that they make there. They've got lots of, I won't call them case studies, lots of stories to tell about organizations who've achieved good results off the basis of using social technologies, but a story is anecdotal evidence. It doesn't really count as scientific evidence. So you have to ask yourself, just because one company's done it, how generalizable is that result? Could other companies go and do the same thing? Some people have become, I would say, almost hysterical. Now, this is Mark Fiedelman, I think you pronounce his name. I've not met him. I'm sure he's a good guy. I've seen a recording of a presentation that he did at the SharePoint conference in Vegas. He's got 10,000 followers on Twitter. If you have a look at his LinkedIn profile, he describes himself as a sales and marketing expert. Okay? He's a sales guy. So he's then promoting his own book, which is based on interviews with 150 executives, which I haven't read. I'm a conscientious objector to that one. And this is the way he's promoting his book on Twitter. Those of you who embraced social business, are promoted, paid more, and are more impactful on their company. I haven't read his book, so it's a little bit out of order for me to criticize him, but I think that if I read his book, I would struggle to find evidence to back those statements up. Okay? So always ask yourself, what's your evidence for this? I won't read down the rest, but you get the idea. Okay, so the problem then with social. So I've shown that it's kind of changing the world, it's changing people's lives, the market is huge, and that there's a lot of hype around it. So what's the problem? So the first problem is, when it comes to social, that nobody can actually define it, or there's no clear and agreed definition to these things. This is IBM having a go. We define social business as embedding social tools, media, and practices into the ongoing activities of an organization. Okay, fair enough. I'm sort of with you so far. And then it starts to get a bit ropey for me. Social business enables individuals to connect, okay, and share information and insights more effectively with others. Social business tools facilitate engagement and extensive discussion. Sorry, you've lost me there. What does that mean? How do you know when you're doing that? Okay, it sounds really good. It trips off the tongue nicely. It's a kind of a good vision. But then when you sit there and think, how would I know when I'm doing that? Then you start to get yourself into a bit of trouble. So that's IBM trying to define social business. Maybe Yammer can do a little bit better. So this is Adam Pisoni. He's the CTO and one of the founders for Yammer, who's probably in a very good mood, having just sold his business for $1.2 billion and got a nice job. Surely this guy can describe to us what the value proposition, I mean, he knows what the value proposition is. He took $1.2 billion. But surely he can describe the value proposition of this thing called social. So this is what he said on stage at the SharePoint conference. It's about openness that facilitates connections. Openness drives discovery, and that's the value. And now there's a bit that starts to get me a bit twitchy. That's not something you can measure on a return on investment basis. So I spend quite a lot of time going into organizations, talking to executives, and they say to me, Simon, they say, why should we go and deploy social tools? Why should we deploy Yammer? And I can just imagine if I stood there and said, well, you should deploy Yammer because it's about openness that facilitates connections. It drives discovery, and that's the value, and that's not something you can measure on an ROI basis. I would get bounced out of that boardroom so quickly, and I wouldn't be invited back. Evidence. This is the other problem with social. I mean, I've just kind of picked on these randomly. You know, these are the ones that came up when I was putting this deck together. This is Jive. They tweeted this 19th of March, new SocialBiz study. There's proof. Now, to an academic, of course, proof, dangerous word, red rag to a bull, of hard ROI and payback for social collaboration technology. Download it. So I downloaded it. I thought, there's proof. They grew the top line value by 2 to 4%. You know, my personal favorite, reduced the time to find knowledge, expertise, and best practices by 34%. Who wouldn't buy one? Why would you not rush out and buy one with results like that? But of course, none of this actually counts as evidence really in the scientific sense. This is basically marketing, and I'll use a strong word, it's marketing propaganda. And I actually think that this is really unhelpful, because executives and decision makers read this sort of stuff and they just become more skeptical. And again, you know, you get thrown out. So it must be magic, okay? These aren't my words. So this is Mark Fiedelman again, who writes for Forbes, and he interviewed a CEO for a company, and And this is what the CEO said about social tools that they had deployed. They're not talking about SharePoint here, okay? They're talking about another vendor. You can't stop it. Once you make it available to people, the magic happens. Excellent. Sometimes people ask me to quantify in euros or dollars what the platform has delivered. I tell them to look at the change in mindset, the information sharing, and how quickly information passes around. He doesn't know. He's got absolutely no idea what value the technology is delivering into his organization. And the thing that drives me crazy about this is, have we really reached the stage in this industry where our justification for deploying enterprise software is that the magic happens? And then when somebody asks us afterwards, what results did you get from that? You say, don't worry about the euros or dollars. Look at the change in mindset. That's what we needed. Look how quickly that information flows around. Hashtag nonsense, in my opinion. So I thought, well, I can't let that go. And I went off and I wrote a blog article, which is on my website, and I came back and I put in the comments on this thing. I said, I couldn't disagree more. I've written a riposte, and then I put a link to the blog post. What is the truth? So don't take my word for it. Let's have a look what the analysts say. So here's Gartner, and they say, who can doubt Gartner? If you surveyed, I'm not being unjust in the way that I'm looking at this. You could put all the same arguments to their opinions as well. Let's see what else we have to say. So these are two Gartner analysts who wrote a book, Bradley and McDonald, The Social Organization, and they say, one of our more striking discoveries is that most social media initiatives fail. Oh dear. Either they don't attract any interest or they never create any business value. So we're starting to get a little bit more balance into the argument now. What really, really brought it home for me was when, it has to be an off the record, I have to keep this person anonymous. I wish I could tell you, but I can't. This is a very, very senior executive from one of the world's leading social, enterprise social computing services providers, okay? You would know who this person was. And I accosted them one day. I chased them across a conference hall floor and jogged up alongside. I said, do you mind if I talk to you? And they went, oh, God. And they kept walking. I said, I'm an MVP, and he slowed down. I said, and I'm doing a doctorate, and he slowed down a bit more, and I got about 30 seconds of his time. And he said, bearing in mind, he makes his living selling this stuff. We don't know why enterprise social networking, I've inserted that bit, works. All of the evidence is anecdotal. He actually also said the academics haven't figured it out yet. We're looking at organizational structure. But he flies around the world selling this stuff to senior executives and then says off the record, I actually don't know why it works. Are you with me so far? Yeah? How's the hangover? Any questions so far?
About the hangover?
Go for it. So there's no such thing as social business. What do I mean by that? Social business, I think, first of all, is a bit of a tautology because you can't have a business without it being social. I mean, even in terms of sort of, from an economic perspective, business and economics is a social science. So it's a tautological statement. All of these phrases really have been made up essentially by people trying to sell you things, okay? So we start off really with Web 2.0. Web 2.0 was an industry term to describe technologies that enable two-way participation and conversation on the web. It's a technical term, okay? So Andrew McAfee obviously used that as the basis for the term that he coined, Enterprise 2.0. And even though he's an academic, he was ultimately, of course, trying to enhance his own reputation and then sell a book. Then the Dakis group came along and they started arguing for this thing called social business. Now, to be honest, my view is because that was invented by a marketing organisation, I always take social business to have more of an external-facing perspective. Not entirely, but it's more about interacting with partners and customers and suppliers potentially, rather than focusing on your own internal workforce, although they do emphasise that as well. Microsoft tends to use the term enterprise social rather than social business, and my interpretation of that is, again, badly defined, but my interpretation of that is that because of their product set, they're a lot more focused inside the firewall. So that's a lot more about productivity and information workers. But all of these terms, as I say, are just kind of made up. The term that I tend to use is just social, which is a shorthand for enterprise social computing. And social computing is a generic term which is basically concerned with the use of computers and IT at the intersection of social relationships. So using computers to change the way that people interact with each other. The rest of it, to be honest, I think is hashtag nonsense again. Okay, so strategy. Let's kind of get into some stuff. How can we actually make this stuff work? This is a guy called, I can't even pronounce this very well. I think he's Hungarian. Michael Polanyi. As you can see, died in 1976. He is, let me check here. Yes, he's Hungarian. I keep wanting to say Bulgarian. He's Hungarian. And he was a scientist. He did lots of maths and chemistry and that sort of thing. But he also made a big contribution to the philosophy of science by talking about what knowledge is, okay? So many of you will have heard the terms explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge. Nod, say yes, Simon. Shake your head, no? Okay. So he wrote a book called The Tacit Dimension in the 1960s. And he was arguing that knowledge is all based on experience, okay? And that you can't really write down knowledge. That, as I say, knowledge, in order to have knowledge, you need to have a mind, you need to have a knower, okay? So he talked about that being tacit knowledge. But then he also said that some knowledge, to a certain degree, is what he called codifiable. You can write it down, okay? And you can therefore transmit it and transfer it to other people. So this really got picked up by the Knowledge Management Brigade in the 1990s. And this split between tacit and explicit knowledge is one that kind of flows through, as I say, all of the knowledge management things. So think about SharePoint, okay, and social. If you're looking at explicit knowledge, it can be written down. Then you're probably talking about documents and searching for documents and metadata and things like that. On the other hand, if the knowledge in your organisation is tacit, if you've got experts and it's all based on experience, then you're talking really about tacit knowledge. And maybe then you want to use things like people search, for instance. Very simple terms. So there were some guys in the 1990s who did a piece of research, bear with me on this, did a piece of research based around knowledge management strategies. And they basically said, if in an organisation you find yourselves solving the same problems over and over again, so repeatable kind of knowledge-based services, then it's likely that you would follow what they called a codification strategy. So exactly as I've just said, putting people in touch with documents. On the other hand, if what you do is solve diverse problems, if every time one of your clients comes to you, you have to go through a different process to deliver services to them, then that's likely to be based on experience, tacit knowledge, and you'd follow a strategy called personalization. Moving it into the social network space, there's another guy who came along in the early 1990s called Rob Cross, and he started looking at social networks. Now, this is before Facebook and all of the rest of it from a technology point of view. He did surveys to find out how people were connected to each other in organizations, and we'll look at some of his work in it in a moment. But he basically identified two different network configurations in an organization, and they correspond to the two strategies that I've just described. So the first network configuration was what he called a dense network, which is where people really know each other very well and have what we'll talk about in a moment. They have strong ties to each other, okay? And that's really good if you've got tacit knowledge, where you're trying to share experience. You need to know people well. It relies on trust. The other sort of network configuration that he noted was where the network was quite sparse and diverse, so people maybe only saw each other every now and again, like maybe people do on Twitter. So this idea of explicit and tacit knowledge flows through into your knowledge management strategy and then potentially up into your network configurations as well. We'll come back to those thoughts in just a moment. So there's two main arguments that people use around social technologies. The first one is the productivity argument, yeah? You've all heard this. We'll install SharePoint or Yammer and people will be more productive. This is Peter Drucker. He's the man who most people kind of say coined the phrase knowledge worker about the 1960s or 70s. He's also the man which, according to a front cover on Business Week magazine, invented management. That's not a bad title to have. So he wrote an article in the California Management Review, California Management Review, in 1999. And he basically said, this is what he's saying here, he said, look, the most important contribution of management during the last century was the 50-fold increase in manual worker productivity. And he says that the greatest challenge for management in the coming century, and we're only 13 years into it, so it's no surprise we haven't cracked it, the greatest challenge for management in the current century is improving the productivity of the knowledge worker. Okay, so productivity, therefore, is important, is the point that I'm making. But what is it? If you're going to increase it, you have to be able to define it. You have to be able to measure it. And if you want to prove that you have increased it, you have to say what it was to start with, measure it again, and show what it is afterwards. So this is a random photograph of Bing images, of course, not Google images. Who would use that? And this gentleman is in a knife grinding factory, okay? So he is a kind of classic example of a manual production worker. So productivity is basically a measurement of the efficiency, the economic efficiency of production, okay? And it's typically expressed as a ratio. So he might, for instance, measure his productivity in terms of, I grind 7 knives an hour, okay? That sort of thing. What he does is quite easy to identify, define, and manage. Now, a guy came along in the early 1900s called Frederick Winslow Taylor. You may have heard of him, Taylorism, style of management. Hello. Style of management, sometimes called scientific management. And what he did was he got his clipboard and his stopwatch, and he stood there and watched people like this gentleman, and he worked out how to make them more productive. And the way that you make them more productive is you put their machines closer together, you make it more comfortable for them to stand up. And people like him, for instance, might stand in factories for 14 hours a day and just screw things together. And that's all they do, really treating people like machines. This, of course, is the modern knowledge worker. I can see a few people looking like that, sitting in the audience. So the trouble with knowledge workers is it's really difficult to define what their task is. Okay? And bear in mind, if you're trying to measure their productivity, you need to know what they produce. So how do you measure the productivity of a doctor, a nurse, a lawyer, an engineer, management consultants? How do you manage that? It's very difficult to see what they actually produce. People often say to me, Simon, what do you do? I go, yeah, I find that really difficult to explain to people. Knowledge workers also have some kind of particular characteristics. So they tend to like to be autonomous. Okay? So I'm very lucky in the work that I do. I'm allowed to come and go as I please. Nobody asks me where I am. Nobody asks me what I'm doing. As long as I keep my customers happy, internal and external, then I have complete autonomy in the role that I have. Knowledge workers need to learn all of the time because you're standing there in the production factory just screwing things on. You don't need to learn very much. Okay, but if you're advising clients, if you're practicing in law or medicine or engineering or something like that, you've always got to keep up with what's going on in your industry and your organization. So with their productivity, there's two dimensions to look at. Time, how long does it take, but also quality. And that's very difficult to measure, as I say, with knowledge workers. Now, to be fair, I said there's no such thing as social business, and people talk a whole load of fluffy stuff about this concept of social business. I actually think that there is a very good argument to say that there is, because of the change in the nature of work and the nature of workers, there's an argument to say that we need a new style of management. Okay? And when people say things like social business, it's a mindset, I think that actually what they're talking about is a new type of management style that's required to manage these sorts of people. Okay, so how does social help with productivity? So here's just give you a couple of quick basics. And you've got the concept of weak ties. These people here don't know each other as well, so that's called a weak tie. Okay? And the fact that there's only one person connecting these different groups, this is what's known as a structural hole in the network. Okay? Structural holes are potentially bad, and you might want to manage them out. Okay? So, social network research isn't new. There's a guy popped up in the 1930s, can't remember his name now, but he basically said, wouldn't it be a great idea to map the relationships between everybody in New York City? And everybody said, you're crazy, you'll never do it. And of course, look what we're doing these days with Facebook. He didn't manage to do it, by the way, in the 1930s. So this is relevant to productivity because in 1973, a guy called Granovetter came along, and he produced a paper called The Strength of Weak Ties. Many of you have probably heard this, 'cause it's kind of pretty well-worn argument around social networking. Now, what he showed, he did research into how people find jobs, okay? We have LinkedIn these days, of course. But apparently you usually find jobs not through the people who you maybe sit in the office with every day and have strong ties. You're more likely to get a job by somebody you bump into in the pub and you go, I haven't seen you since that conference. What are you doing these days? Oh, I'm doing this, I'll come and work for me. That's the way it works, okay? So the argument around productivity is that weak ties help with finding novel information, okay? It's a speed of search. That's why it helps with productivity. That's the argument, okay? Does anybody believe that? Yeah? Does anybody just flat out disbelieve it? Does anybody wish they'd gone to bed at least 2 hours early and not had that last drink? Okay. Well, it's a reasonable argument, okay? That the idea is that you can find information faster by having an extensive network is a reasonable argument. But there's a but. So this is some more research that was done in the 1990s, partly done by a guy called it's codified knowledge, stuff we can write down, then weak ties are particularly good for transferring that. So if we just kind of have a look at this without going through it all in detail, there's one more thing as well that he said, and that's the idea of how dependent is the knowledge that you're trying to transfer. So if I ask a question, you give me an answer, but understanding your answer depends on something you know that I don't, that kind of doesn't really help me very much. That's the dependency side of things. So look, basically what he found out was that if you're in a situation where you've got weak ties and highly codified, i.e. written down knowledge that's independent, that you don't need any context for, then potentially social networks are advantageous to you because you can search for it and you can transfer it. But in the other three sets of circumstances, it maybe doesn't work so well, okay? So what we conclude from that is that yes, social networking as part of social computing can potentially help with productivity, but in only sort of 1 out of 4 different sets of circumstances. You ever heard people say, oh, it'd have been quicker to do it myself? That's this kind of problem. There's another argument that's often used around productivity. Oh, I'm going to have to pick up the pace. Another argument that's used around productivity, and that's employee engagement. People are engaged because we've deployed Yammer. Really? So the research here shows, and this is very recent research done in 2012, I think, somebody went off and did some case studies. One organisation failed with their internal social media. One organisation was successful. So what we're talking about here is capital, emotional capital. The idea is that there is value in the feelings of emotional attachment that an individual has to their organisation. And basically what they said, go through these very quickly, they said that if leaders, I mean, look at the quotes at the top, research suggests that most successful employee communities tend to be actively managed by executives, which is maybe counterintuitive to what we think about it all being viral and bottom up. Actually, you need leaders to get involved. And they said that the leaders that are successful do these, what they call 4 pillars of emotional capital. So authenticity, you must do the same online if you're a leader as you do in real life. So there's no point, for instance, posting out on Yammer, we're all in this together, and then making a load of people redundant, okay? Because you've got a discrepancy, so that destroys trust. You've got the idea of pride. So, leaders can post out there on Yammer, well done to the sales team in New York. They sold $1 gazillion worth of stuff. Well done, everyone. And people think, oh, yeah, that's great. I've been acknowledged in public by the leader. The idea of attachment is that you use the network to communicate the fact that you all have shared values. Okay, so we all belong together. We're all in this together. And as well, fun. So it's not all about serious stuff. The executives maybe might want to post some pictures out there of themselves at a party at Pasha with a plastic coconut and a pair of flashing glasses, for instance. So the idea is that if you have emotional attachment, people are more strongly motivated. Another thing on the performance side is the idea of team performance. So team performance, imagine this is a project team or a business unit. This is actually Rob Cross's work, and he's, again, done this by survey. And what he's done is he surveyed a business unit just after a merger and acquisition, and looked at it, and they said, oh, look, if this person leaves, you've got a problem. You've also got bottlenecks going on in here with the way that information flows around, and this person might not be important on the organisation chart, but as far as the informal network is concerned, they have lots of power and the ability to influence. So they went off and they put in place some kind of HR practices and some working practices, nothing to do with technology, came back, and 9 months later, you can see that the whole business unit is a lot more connected, and the idea is that that then produces higher degrees of productivity. Okay, so that's the productivity argument. And in summary, yes, it can help, but not always. Don't just think that more connectivity and applying more and more technology is necessarily a good thing. Some people come along and they say, look, everybody's using Yammer. It must be great. It must be getting lots of productivity increases. Not necessarily. Whew, there's a good slide, eh? That works well with the hangover. So innovation. This is all about innovation. So innovation really... Communities of practice. So have I mentioned SharePoint yet? I'll mention SharePoint. So SharePoint 2013, of course, has got new community features, a community site template to support this type of thing. So communities of practice have been described as the killer application for knowledge management. And it is a knowledge management technique. It goes back to research in the 1990s done around what they call social or situated learning. And the research originally was around, well, we put people in classrooms and teach them stuff at work, but then do they actually use that? And then what was found through this research is actually no, people tend to learn off the people they work with. And the way they transfer knowledge within their communities of practice is they tell each other stories. They did a case study of 2 engineers went out to fix a photocopying machine, and they actually listened to the way that they did it, and the training that they'd had, the manual, didn't work. So what they did was they started saying, well, I remember this one time when so-and-so did this, and that kind of didn't work. And somebody else said, oh, well, I remember actually they tried this. And by taking those different stories and narratives and combining them, they were able to find a solution to the problem. So communities of practice have got nothing to do with SharePoint or technology at all, apart from the fact that social can support communities of practice at a much larger scale. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through it, but the community template in SharePoint 2013 supports this process. And what this process actually shows is the idea that you ask a community of practice a question, and through giving feedback and star ratings and badges and all that kind of stuff, the right answers or the community's answers or opinion bubble to the top. This is taken from that book I mentioned earlier, The Social Organisation, by the two Gartner analysts. Okay, so call to action, doing social. Let's have a look. So the first thing is, this is the last section, we're going to hopefully have some time for some questions as well. So the first question is, I know this is what gets me thrown out of people's offices. I say, what are you trying to do? And they say, we're trying to do document management, social computing, social intranet, collaboration, whatever it might be. This is a classic example taken from an RFP. I see hundreds of these every year. This was the vision at the front of a 30 or 40-page document. I think it was the communications director. The development of a global intranet will revolutionize the way our people locate and communicate with one another and how they share information, innovation, and best practice. It will be one central hub for people to find, share, and contribute information. It will replace isolated failed ventures, red flag, and it has the ability to improve employee effectiveness and productivity. Does this have any resonance with anyone? Do you kind of recognize this sort of thing from your own organizations? It's not bad as a vision. It can motivate people. Everybody goes, yeah, we want to get behind that. We want to do it. But then the killer question is, as I've already said, what are you trying to do? How will you know when you're doing that? Well, you just won't, will you? Well, we'll have deployed SharePoint. We'll have everybody on Yammer. That's how we'll know. No. So this is what you might call, or what I call, a traditional business infrastructure. This is actually where 99.9% of the organizations I talk to are. You go in and you talk to them about their technology. We've got file shares and folders. Every department's got its own file share. Every project has got its own folder. Every individual has got their own folder. They're all locked down for permissions. And if you're not in that department, you can't access stuff. So what we do is we email all the documents to each other. Oh, and we've also got line of business applications like CRM and brain blank, ERP systems, those sorts of things, okay? On the structural side, it's probably the old scientific management type of thing comes through. You know, so we're departments, we're hierarchy, we've got lots of bureaucracy in place. I heard a great quote about bureaucracy. Apparently, bureaucracy is what you have when you can't trust your people. We have narrow incentives. So a question I always ask clients, I say, well, where's the profit and loss accounts in your organisation? And I say, we've got two business units. Both business units have their own profit and loss account. They both run their own IT budgets. And I'm like, well, what actually is the incentive for those two business units to collaborate with each other? And it's the same at the individual level as well. You know, two people, I've got to do my job. If I've only got a weak tie to you, if I don't know you very well, and my incentive is for me to do my job, why should I help you? Then you've got the cultural things as well. So I've already mentioned the scientific management. You've got to be at your desk by 9 o'clock. You've got to be there till 5:30. It doesn't actually matter what you do whilst you're there, but you've got to be in the office from 9 till 5:30 and only take an hour for lunch. Sometimes if you stay behind late at work, that looks good and you can have a promotion after a while. You've got this idea of closed communication. So it's all done in private emails and nobody can see, you know, what other people. So for instance, if you go back to the employee engagement, it's great for me to get an email off my boss, pat on the head, well done, Simon, you did a great job. But that's not quite the same as posting it up there in the social network so everybody else can see that I've had a pat on the head. It doesn't generate the same level of pride. And then you've got the idea of the silo culture. So there's a traditional business infrastructure. I've resisted using the word social here, but this is the idea I said, today's business infrastructure. So on the technical side, we use technologies like SharePoint and Yammer and Office 365 to support the ways that people work, which typically aren't within the kind of organizational silos, the functional silos. So we have teams. Teams probably get worse, project teams, for instance, who work across in processes that go across the organizational units. We have communities of practice where it's all about social learning and sharing ideas. And then potentially we have the networks as well, and we've already talked about those. On the structural side, we've got a much more modular and flexible organisation, loosely coupled project teams. People might have 3 or 4 different bosses, depending what they're doing and which projects they're working on. Policies and procedures. Did anybody read the articles from Microsoft a couple of years ago called the hybrid organisation? No, because they gave it a really bad name. Why would you read a document called the hybrid organisation? It wasn't about technology, it was about this sort of thing. A couple of quick examples. Work is something I do, not somewhere I go. Brilliant, like that. Measure me on my outputs, not on my inputs. Brilliant, like that. You trust me. They had a couple of examples about organisations, for instance, who don't have holidays. You don't have a holiday entitlement, you can't book a holiday. And if you're sick, you don't have to fill any forms. And they work on the principle that if you come to work, and if you don't come to work, don't come to work. But if you don't do your job, you'll end up getting sacked. But the point is, it doesn't matter where you are. What matters is what you do. Okay? Another one was, we will give everybody in the company a credit card for expenses. Don't need to give us any receipts, and you don't need to fill in an expenses form, because we trust you. I personally would respond very, very well to that type of working environment. I'd be staying in a better hotel, for instance, which of course would motivate me. And you've got the cultural side of things as well. So you've got the idea of a leader who shows some vision around these sorts of things, the trust and openness we've talked about, and the shared values. So again, I say that social business doesn't exist, but I think it's this kind of combination. This is really what people are trying to articulate, and they do it very badly. But it's this set of technical, cultural, and structural changes that you need to make to really take advantage of the technology. And the technology is only one small part of it. Just got a couple of screenshots. This will take just a few minutes. So this is SharePoint 2000. Are intended to be communities of practice. They're not, because people don't use them like that, okay? They're actually just a badge that you put on the bottom of your profile so people know what you're interested in. But if you were to go into a group, then that's the idea of a community of practice. It's that type of thing. This is a project that I... Hello? Oh, okay, there we go. This is a project, actually, that I ran in a former life, 2009, with a Central European bank. And this is, again, is a similar sort of thing. It's a Teams service, so it's around collaboration across business processes. The difference between this and a community site is that anybody can instantly create themselves a team site. On the community service, you have to request it. On the community service, it doesn't get deleted. On the team site, it will get deleted after, let's say, 30 days, unless you actually do something to keep it going. So this only lasts as long as the task that it was set up for is still in process, whereas the community lasts as long as people are interested in it. You've then, of course, got Yammer. So this is a quick screenshot that I've checked for anything confidential. So this is how Microsoft communicate with the MVP community. And this is the Yammer. The use that it is put to. Yeah? So that's one of the challenges with business cases around social and collaborative technology. If you just put out a service and say, you can go and create a team site, but I don't know what you're going to create, I can't possibly measure the value of that before I see what you've done with it. So this idea of services really plays into the business case. There are other uses of social that we kind of haven't really touched on today, and this is just one example. This is a screenshot from a site that Microsoft have set up. Okay? It becomes social when you, for instance, allow people to interact with each other around the content. I found this useful, what did you think? Oh, well, I didn't like that point. A discussion happens around it. So this is actually quite a useful way to use SharePoint and potentially in the future Yammer as a sort of, I would call it a social layer, if you like, over the top of the content that you've got stored in your SharePoint environment. But not necessarily, doesn't really help you necessarily directly with either productivity or innovation. Okay, so key messages. What have we been talking about? So key message, there's no such thing as social business. There is only good business and bad business. Forget concentrating on being a social business, okay? It's not a purpose in itself. Focus on what you're trying to do as an organization and then say, and how could social technologies help us? Technology has, I really believe this, technology has absolutely no value whatsoever without specifically defined purpose. And I guess my final message on here, I'm going to go way back to what Professor Andrew McAfee said in 2006, which is social technologies have the potential to be a transformational management tool. But do not believe for one moment that just deploying this stuff, like any other technology, is just going to improve your, what was it the Jive thing said, improve your productivity by 15%, and to prove it, here's a graph. Don't believe that. That's going backwards. So I'll leave the contacts thing up. That was the last slide in the presentation. Does anybody have any questions?